There was a king who woke up one day and didn't know he was king. He wore the crown. Others bowed. Documents still carried his name. But inside his mind, the throne was empty. He attacked his own men without warning. He forgot his wife. He forgot his children. At times, he believed his body was made of glass, afraid a single touch would shatter him. And yet, France never removed him. For decades, the kingdom chose something far more dangerous than madness. It chose to keep a mad king on the throne. This is not the story of a ruler who lost power. This is the story of a crown that refused to fall, even after the mind beneath it was already gone. About Charles VI of France, history often uses one careless word, mad. But madness does not arrive like a switch being flipped. It begins as a fracture sudden, violent, and impossible to reverse. In the summer of 1392, Charles VI was travelling through the forests of Le Mans. France was not at peace, but the situation was controlled. The king was young, physically strong, and crucially, still seen as capable. There was no warning of what was about to happen. Then, without provocation, Charles drew his sword. He turned on his own men, not enemies, not traitors, his own escort. Accounts describe confusion first, then panic. One knight was struck down and killed. Others fled, unsure whether to defend the king or escape him. Within moments, Charles collapsed, exhausted, unresponsive, his mind seemingly extinguished. This was not a gradual decline. This was a rupture. What followed was something medieval Europe was unprepared to confront. A crowned king whose authority remained intact, but whose mind no longer obeyed him. At first, the court treated the incident as temporary. Illness, they said. Heat. Fatigue. Perhaps divine punishment, perhaps demonic influence. Explanations were offered quickly because certainty was more dangerous than ignorance. But the king did not return to normal. In the weeks that followed, Charles experienced profound disorientation. He failed to recognize members of his own household. At times, he did not recognize his wife. At times, he did not recognize himself. Then came the fear. Charles began to believe his body was made of glass, that a careless touch could shatter him. That movement itself was dangerous. He refused to be held. He avoided contact. He withdrew into stillness, paralyzed by the terror of breaking apart. This was not a metaphor. It was a documented delusion observed by courtiers, servants, and physicians alike. Yet here lies the most unsettling detail. The illness did not remain constant. Charles recovered. At intervals, the king returned to clarity. He spoke coherently. He issued commands. He performed the rituals of kingship convincingly enough to reassure those who needed reassurance most. And then, without warning, he would fall again. This cycle made Charles VI uniquely dangerous to the system around him. A permanently incapacitated king could be removed. A dead king could be replaced. But a king who moved unpredictably between lucidity and collapse created paralysis. The crown could not act decisively because it could not prove that it should. So, instead of removal, the court chose containment. Charles remained king in name, in image, in ceremony. The crown stayed on his head. The throne remained his. But real power began to migrate elsewhere, quietly, deliberately, without formal acknowledgement. The king was protected, isolated, and increasingly managed. Not for his benefit, but for the stability of the crown. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in 1393 at an event later known as the Bal des Ardents. The court organised a masquerade, a display of luxury, excess, and theatrical distraction. Charles participated, dressed as a wild man, his body wrapped in resin-soaked materials meant to resemble hair. It was a fatal choice. A torch was brought too close. Flames erupted instantly. 4 men burned to death in front of the assembled court. Charles survived only because someone smothered the flames around him in time. To modernize, the incident appears reckless. To contemporaries, it confirmed something far more terrifying. The king was no longer safe not to himself and not to others. After that night, the court's approach hardened. The priority was no longer healing the king. It was protecting the idea of kingship. Charles was increasingly removed from decision-making. Access to him was controlled. Information was filtered. Power was exercised in his name, not by his will. And still he was never officially declared unfit to rule. Why? Because declaring the king unfit meant admitting that the crown itself was vulnerable. It meant opening the door to rival claims, civil conflict, and foreign interference. The risks of action outweighed the dangers of inaction, at least in the short term. So France made a choice. It chose continuity over clarity, symbol over substance, a living king over a functioning one. Charles VI became something unprecedented, a monarch whose presence legitimized power while his absence enabled it. This was the moment the fracture became permanent, not because the king was ill, but because everyone around him decided to live with it. In the next part, we will look inside that madness itself, how it behaved, how it returned, and why it never fully released him. Because the most disturbing truth is this: Charles VI did not lose control of France. France learned how to rule without his mind, while keeping his crown exactly where it was. By the late 1390s, the question surrounding Charles VI of France was no longer whether he was ill. It was how that illness behaved and why it never fully released him. Unlike the dramatic collapse in the forest of Le Mans, the madness that followed was not constant. It came in waves. There were periods when Charles appeared entirely lucid. He spoke clearly. He recognized his counsellors. He performed the rituals of kingship with enough precision to convince those watching that the crisis had passed. And then, without warning, the mind would fracture again. During his episodes, Charles experienced profound disturbances of identity. At times, he did not know where he was. At times, he did not know who he was. There are records of him insisting that he had no name, no title, no royal status, even as the crown sat visibly on his head. This was not simple confusion. It was a collapse of self-recognition. One of the most disturbing features of his illness was what modern historians refer to as the glass delusion. Charles became convinced that his body was fragile, made of glass, and that even light physical contact could destroy him. He refused to be touched. He resisted movement. He sat rigidly, terrified that any shift in posture would cause him to shatter. Courtiers padded his clothing. Furniture was adjusted. The court adapted itself around his fear, not to cure it, but to contain it. What made this condition especially destabilizing was its unpredictability. Charles did not descend into permanent incoherence. He oscillated. A king who is always incapable can be replaced. A king who sometimes functions forces everyone around him into uncertainty. No one could determine when the next episode would begin or how severe it would be. And because Charles sometimes recovered, the crown was trapped in hesitation. To declare him unfit would require certainty, and certainty was impossible. Medieval medicine offered no clarity. Physicians debated humoral imbalance, exhaustion, heredity, even supernatural influence. None could explain why the king's mind returned only to collapse again. What the court could observe, however, was pattern. The episodes grew more frequent over time. Recovery became shorter, the periods of clarity less convincing. Yet still, Charles was never formally removed from power. Instead, the monarchy adapted. Decision-making slowly migrated away from the king's direct involvement. Councils expanded. Regents and princes assumed greater authority, always careful to act in his name. The king's presence became symbolic. His signature legitimized actions he no longer fully understood. His image preserved continuity, even as control slipped from his hands. This arrangement carried an unspoken risk. Every time Charles appeared lucid, the illusion of stability returned, and with it, the temptation to pretend nothing was wrong. But the madness did not disappear. It deepened. During later episodes, Charles sometimes failed to recognize his own heraldry. He rejected royal clothing. He resisted ceremonial objects associated with his role. In one documented instance, he denied being married at all, dismissing his queen as a stranger. These moments did not merely embarrass the court. They exposed a terrifying truth. The king no longer inhabited the identity that justified his power. And yet, the crown persisted. Why? Because removing Charles would not end the crisis. It would ignite a far greater one. France was already strained by factional rivalry, dynastic tension, and the looming threat of English intervention. Declaring the king incapacitated would fracture legitimacy at its core. So the monarchy chose endurance over resolution. Charles became increasingly isolated. Access to him was restricted. Information was managed. His episodes were concealed when possible, reframed when necessary. When the king could not appear, excuses were offered. When he could appear, appearances were carefully controlled. The madness was no longer a medical problem. It was a political condition, and it was contagious. As Charles withdrew inward, those around him moved outward, filling the vacuum he left behind. Power consolidated in competing hands. Rival factions learned to operate without royal direction, while still claiming royal approval. The king became a silent witness to decisions he neither initiated nor opposed. In effect, France learned to govern around a broken mind. This arrangement did not stabilize the kingdom. It delayed its reckoning, because every system built on denial eventually collapses not from sudden shock, but from accumulated strain. By the early 15th century, Charles VI was no longer a ruler in any meaningful sense. He was a presence, a symbol, a name. The madness had not destroyed the crown. It had hollowed it out. And that hollow space would soon be filled not by healing, but by conflict. In the next part, we will see how Charles VI's condition reshaped the people around him, how factions hardened, how power turned predatory, and how a kingdom began to tear itself apart while its king still lived. Because the most dangerous consequence of Charles's madness was not what it did to him. It was what it allowed everyone else to become. By the early 15th century, Charles VI of France was still alive. The crown still existed. The throne was still occupied. But France was no longer being ruled by a king. What replaced royal authority was not a single regent nor a clear line of command. It was something far more unstable, a vacuum. In that vacuum, power did not disappear. It multiplied. Every decision made in the king's name created an opportunity for others to speak louder, move faster, and claim legitimacy without accountability. The absence of a functioning monarch did not slow the system, it loosened it. And loose systems invite predators. At first, the transfer of authority appeared orderly. Councils expanded. Senior princes took on greater responsibility. Documents continued to bear the king's seal, maintaining the illusion of continuity. But behind that surface calm, rivalries hardened. Without a coherent royal will to arbitrate disputes, political factions began to act independently and then aggressively. Influence was no longer earned through proximity to the king's judgment, but through control of access to his person. Who could see the king? Who could speak for him? Who could claim to understand his intentions? These questions mattered more than policy. Charles's illness made him unpredictable, but his presence made him invaluable. As long as he lived, no rival could openly claim the throne. As long as he remained king, every faction could present itself as loyal, even while undermining one another. The monarchy became a stage. The king, its silent prop. This arrangement did not simply weaken authority, it distorted it. Power became procedural rather than moral. Decisions were justified by legality, not judgment. If a document was sealed correctly, its consequences no longer mattered. In this environment, ambition thrived. Princes and nobles learned to rule without consequence, shielded by the king's symbolic authority. Failures could be blamed on circumstance. Atrocities could be framed as necessity. The crown absorbed responsibility without exercising control. This was not governance. It was exploitation. As the king withdrew further into isolation, France fractured along political and personal lines. Rival camps hardened their positions, not because the king commanded it, but because no one could stop them. The court did not collapse into chaos overnight. It learned to function while hollow. That hollowing had a cost. Without a central authority capable of decisive intervention, violence became a tool of negotiation. Disputes that once would have been settled through royal arbitration now escalated into intimidation, sabotage, and eventually open conflict. The king's madness did not cause these actions, but it removed the barrier that might have restrained them. And the longer the situation endured, the more normal it became. Children grew into adulthood having never known a fully present king. Officials learned to operate without accountability. The absence of royal judgment ceased to feel like a crisis. It became routine. In this environment, loyalty lost its meaning. To be loyal no longer meant obedience to the king's will. It meant allegiance to whichever faction offered protection, advancement, or survival. The crown remained a prize, but the king himself became irrelevant. This was the true transformation of power under Charles VI. Not the loss of authority, but its mutation. Power no longer flowed downward from the throne. It spread sideways, fragmented, contested, and increasingly violent. And because Charles was still alive, no reset was possible. No coronation. No formal transfer. No moment of clarity. Only prolonged suspension. Foreign powers watched closely. A kingdom unable to govern itself invites intervention. The longer France drifted without coherent leadership, the more vulnerable it became, not through weakness, but through internal division. What made this period especially dangerous was the persistence of legitimacy. France did not appear leaderless. It was leaderless. The king's seal continued to function. The throne remained occupied. Ceremony continued. But authority had detached from responsibility. This detachment reshaped behavior at every level of governance. Officials acted boldly, knowing the king would never contradict them. Rivals escalated, knowing no final judgment would arrive. The absence of royal punishment emboldened excess. The madness had stopped being personal. It had become systemic. And yet, Charles VI himself was not the villain of this story. He did not choose this role. He did not design this outcome. His illness removed his capacity, not his humanity. The real decision was made around him. France chose to preserve the symbol of kingship rather than confront the consequences of its failure. It chose delay over resolution, stability over truth. That choice bought time. It also sowed the conditions for collapse. By the time Charles VI faded almost completely from public life, the damage was irreversible. The kingdom had adapted too well to his absence. What followed was not sudden ruin, but prolonged disintegration. In the next part, we will examine the final stage of this transformation: how a living king presided over the erosion of unity, how legitimacy fractured beyond repair, and how France entered one of the darkest periods of its history while its crown still sat firmly in place. Because the most dangerous form of power is not tyranny. It is power that no longer answers to anyone, not even the king whose name it still uses. By the time Charles VI of France faded almost entirely from public life, the decision to keep him on the throne had already reshaped France in irreversible ways. What began as caution had become policy. What began as sympathy had hardened into calculation. The crown was preserved. The cost was everything beneath it. At first, the price seemed abstract. Authority blurred. Decisions slowed. Rival voices grew louder. But as the years passed, those abstract consequences became physical. Without a king capable of arbitration, disputes no longer ended, they escalated. Noble rivalries, once restrained by royal judgment, hardened into permanent hostility. Personal ambition filled the silence left by royal will. The monarchy had chosen continuity over clarity. What it received in return was paralysis. Nowhere was this more visible than in the rise of competing power blocks within France itself. Factions no longer sought the king's favour. They sought control of access to his name. To speak for the king became more valuable than speaking to him. This distortion poisoned the political atmosphere. Decisions were justified not because they were wise, but because they were legal. The royal seal replaced royal judgment. Process replaced responsibility. And with responsibility removed, restraint vanished. Violence followed. Not sudden collapse, but incremental erosion. Intimidation became negotiation. Force replaced persuasion. Actions once unthinkable became merely inconvenient. The king's illness did not cause this brutality, but by removing the final authority capable of stopping it, it allowed brutality to thrive. The consequences extended beyond the court. Provincial governance weakened as local lords exploited the absence of effective oversight. Taxation became inconsistent. Justice uneven. Loyalty transactional. France no longer felt like a single kingdom governed from the centre. It felt like a collection of territories competing beneath a shared symbol. Foreign powers noticed. A crown that remains visibly intact while authority fractures beneath it sends a dangerous signal. It suggests stability but invites interference. France appeared strong. It was not. Diplomacy grew brittle. Alliances shifted. The kingdom's internal divisions became leverage for external ambition. Still, the crown was not removed. Why endure this cost? because removing Charles VI would have forced France to confront a truth it was unwilling to face, that legitimacy itself could fail. Declaring the king unfit would have shattered the myth of divine continuity. It would have admitted that the crown was not eternal, only inherited. So, France delayed. Each year of delay increased the price. A generation grew up under a king who did not rule. They learned politics without accountability, power without consequence. By the time Charles was little more than a living symbol, the habits formed in his absence had hardened. Even had he recovered fully, which he did not, the system no longer required him. This was the deepest cost of all. The crown survived. The monarchy did not. By preserving the symbol at all costs, France undermined the substance it was meant to protect. Kingship became something that could exist without judgment, without intervention, without leadership. And once that precedent existed, it could not be undone. Charles VI lived for decades after his mind fractured. During that time, France learned how to function without a functioning king. What it did not learn was how to recover. By the time the crown finally passed to another, the damage was already institutional. Factionalism was normalized. Violence legitimized. Authority fragmented. The crown remained intact but hollow. This was not the story of a single mad king destroying his realm. It was the story of a realm choosing not to act, and discovering too late that inaction has consequences of its own. In the final part, we will confront the legacy of that choice. How France attempted to rebuild authority after decades without it, and what Charles VI ultimately left behind. Because the most enduring damage of his reign was not madness, it was what happened when everyone else learned to live with it. When Charles VI of France finally died in 1422, France did not fall silent. There was no sudden rupture, no dramatic collapse, no moment of release. The kingdom continued, and that, more than anything else, revealed the true legacy of the mad king. By the time Charles VI passed away, France had already learned how to exist without him. The crown changed hands, but the habits formed during his reign remained intact. Power had long since detached from the person of the king. This is where most historical narratives make a mistake. They treat Charles's death as an ending. It was not. It was confirmation. For decades, France had lived under a monarch who could not rule, and instead of breaking, the system adapted. Not by becoming healthier, but by becoming harder. Authority no longer required judgment, only procedure. Loyalty no longer meant obedience to a king's will, only alignment with whoever controlled access to legitimacy. Violence no longer felt like rebellion. It felt like governance. These were not temporary distortions. They were structural changes. The monarchy that survived Charles VI was not the monarchy that had existed before him. It was a thinner version, more symbolic, more fragile, more vulnerable to manipulation. The crown endured. The meaning of kingship did not. Future rulers inherited a throne whose authority could be claimed without responsibility. They inherited a system that had proven it could function while hollow, and once that precedent exists, it cannot be erased. Charles VI did not introduce madness into the monarchy. He exposed what happened when legitimacy was protected at all costs, even when it no longer served the people it governed. The cost was not only political, it was psychological. A generation grew up under a king they rarely saw and never truly knew. For them, authority was distant, impersonal, and unanswerable. That distance changed how power was understood. It taught nobles that patience mattered less than proximity. That law mattered more than justice. That survival mattered more than loyalty. And when power learns these lessons, it does not forget them. The tragedy of Charles VI is often framed as personal. A mind that broke. A king who lost himself. But that framing is incomplete. The deeper tragedy lies in what everyone else chose to do next. France could have confronted the failure of kingship. It could have redefined legitimacy. It could have accepted instability in order to rebuild authority honestly. Instead, it chose preservation. It preserved the crown. It preserved ceremony. It preserved the appearance of continuity. And in doing so, it preserved dysfunction. Charles VI became a warning that went unheeded. Not that kings can go mad, history already knew that. But that systems which refuse to adapt honestly will adapt quietly, until the damage becomes normal. By the end of his life, Charles VI was barely a participant in his own reign. He did not orchestrate France's fragmentation. He did not command its violence. He did not design its failures. But he made them possible simply by remaining. And France allowed it simply by waiting. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of his legacy. The most destructive reigns are not always those marked by cruelty or ambition. They are the ones where responsibility dissolves, where power survives without accountability, and where no one is forced to decide when enough is enough. Charles VI left behind no manifesto, no ideology, no grand vision. He left behind a precedent that a kingdom can endure without a functioning king, that authority can persist without judgment, that legitimacy can be maintained even when its foundations have collapsed. And once those lessons are learned, they shape everything that follows. Charles VI is remembered as the mad king. But madness was not his legacy. His legacy was silence, delay, and the long shadow cast by a crown that refused to fall, even when the mind beneath it had been gone for years. This is why Charles VI still matters. Not because he lost control, but because everyone else learned how to rule without it. And that, in the end, proved far more dangerous than madness itself. Charles VI was not destroyed by madness. He was erased by silence. The crown survived him. The system learned to function without him. And when power no longer needs a mind to guide it, it becomes something far more dangerous than a mad king. History does not repeat itself through chaos. It repeats itself through acceptance. If this story unsettled you, it's because it was never really about the past. Subscribe not for answers, but for the histories that still refuse to disappear, because some crowns don't fall. They wait. Thanks for watching.